recording. All right. Okay, tape 255. Um, so like I said, I was very thankful for Nancy's help with that demonstration. I hope we gave you a chance to see some of the techniques in action. So like every theory, there are some major criticisms that come along with narrative therapy. It's not always the best fit for every situation. Firstly, despite being a theory that really acknowledges the influence of society and other people on the individual, narrative therapy is still a theory that is focused very much on the individual. So there's some criticism that it doesn't really acknowledge family and social systems enough. It's not really a modality that you'd want to use for family or couples counseling because you're focused so much on that individual. Now, there have been some movements within narrative therapy to adapt it in ways that are helpful for family and couples counseling, but its original intention was for individual clients. Because narrative therapy is so client-driven, the client is the one determining the subject, the length, and other features of the session. This makes it not really an effective method for crisis work, whereas crisis counselors, we need to jump in and address safety, and we have certain structural requirements that we need to touch upon. So instead, it's really important for counselors using narrative therapy to discuss how to handle crisis with their clients before that crisis ever happens, which regardless of what modality you use, please do that anyway. But this is a place where narrative therapists can provide other resources like crisis line numbers, mobile crisis numbers. So if the client finds themselves in crisis after a session or between sessions, they know where to reach out to. So I kind of mentioned this before, but because we're getting away from pathologizing clients, traditionally narrative therapy was not meant to be a diagnosing modality. So we're not providing a diagnosis of a mental illness or treatment plan like other models do. This is a concern because we live in a reality, however subjective, where we're expected to be billing and being reimbursed based on diagnostic codes. So if you do decide that narrative therapy is sort of the path you want to take, you may need to consider the realities of the context that you're providing therapy in, and how you're going to kind of address those aspects. And then finally, there's been some very real criticism that narrative therapy can kind of come across patronizing. We're focusing on the silver lining of the client's narrative. This is why it's really important to be careful that the decisions about reauthoring are coming from the client. We want them to feel empowered. We want there to be a sense of hope and a reduction of suffering. I mean, that's why we do what we do. But we also don't want to dismiss real pain and suffering in order to gloss over a difficult narrative. So again, if you're choosing to use narrative therapy with clients, you really have to make sure that that reauthoring of the narrative and the choosing of new narratives is coming from the client, and it's not us wanting to solve their problems. So we covered a lot of information with a lot of little hiccups. So just to kind of give a summary, narrative therapy is a client-driven approach where the client is the expert in their experiences, and the counselor is the expert in the process. The client shares their subjective reality and their narrative of their experiences, and then the counselor uses specialized techniques such as externalization, deconstruction, outside witnesses, and so on to tease more details out from the client. Hopefully through that process, they're able to find a subordinate storyline which is different from the failure or the problem um, focused narrative that the client may have started with. If the client chooses to, they can then reauthor their narrative to take into account some of those details, which is perfect because this is a good place to stop for questions, and I see that there is one. So what is your suggestion for a counselor to focus on since there is a lack of diagnosis? Would this work for a substance abuse counselor? Potentially. So it is a very good modality for returning power to the client and returning that sense of agency and control, which can actually be a really good place for clients with substance abuse disorders to approach, because it gives them power and control again in sort of how they view their life, how they maybe view their substance use, the reasons why they got engaged in substance use, and even their recovery. That being said, diagnosis of a substance abuse disorder is a big one for reimbursement, for even providing therapy, being able to do it. So you're going to have to balance that with, using maybe narrative therapy techniques and some of the philosophies behind it, but at the same time, like being realistic of, you're going to need a diagnostic criteria. And like you said, with the crisis work, that's a good point too, is for substance use clients, you may have to start your relationship with them really talking about, okay, we're going to be focusing on this narrative. What happens if you're getting tempted to use between sessions while we're working through this really tough stuff? What is our plan of action for that kind of crisis moment? So really solidifying with them what are our safety plans and coping skills that they're going to use in those in-betweens. But that would be a really good narrative document to write out, is that safety plan. Any other questions at this point?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
And this is concerning the outside witnessing.
Mhm.
Would it be safer to provide some form of, I guess, guidelines, or maybe even a document on the process of when that person comes in?
So that is a decision that is really made in collaboration with the client. So the counselor may suggest bringing in an outside witness, but the client is who gets to say yes or no and to choose. Um, there are some different ways of doing that outside witnessing. One of the ones, I guess this is the traditional way of doing it, which was really interesting to me, was that they had a one-sided mirror. Um, so the outside witness would be watching the client counselor session, um, and then the witness and the client would switch. And so the client was watching the counselor and the witness talk about the session, which was kind of interesting because it's almost like they're stepping into an audience position. They're not interacting
Yes.
like you would with family therapy or counseling. Um, so in terms of like how things are processed and discussed, um, I didn't see in my readings anything particularly structured because it is so individualized. Um, but there was a lot of focus on the point of the witness isn't for the witness to share their experiences with whatever the problem is, it's to share their experience hearing the narrative. So if it was like let's say a couple and you brought the other partner in, um, you wouldn't have that partner describe the fight that happened. You'd have them say, "Oh, when I heard the client talk about this fight, it really made me reflect on this," um, and so it's a little bit distanced in that sense. Did that answer your question?
Yes. I'm just I'm just wondering about just having the outside person coming in and getting the realness that's needed. It's almost like, well, I know I'm going to go to this office and I know I'm going to talk to this counselor, but I don't want to make the other person feel bad. So I'm gonna talk it up to the point where everything is sweet and nice and all
Mhm.
mellow. And it's just because you're probably having this person in for the first time ever. It's just leading up to that, helping them to reach that realness point and talking about the importance of it. It's almost like I think there will be an introduction to this approach and what it's for, to try to get them to get some of that realness.
Yeah, and that's a good idea, to sort of discuss with the client, like, what do you actually want to get from this witness coming in? Like, what are you hoping to hear from them? Um, because there could be that very realistic, oh, I'm going to say what I think I should say because we're in front of this counselor and I'm going to be sugary sweet, like you said.
Yes.
Um,
And then the opposite of having that person come in and the client realizing that maybe this is the wrong person. So how do I stop this? I don't want this person to say certain things.
yeah, and those are things to consider with the client.
That
So,
you may not like what you hear, but it's going to be said.
yep. How are you going to adjust to this?
Thank you.
Stairs had questions about, is this a good idea to use with a patient with a trauma? Would relieving the events impact them in a worse way? So that is actually an interesting note. Narrative therapy has been shown to be particularly useful, for folks, working through traumatic events. Now, as we're learning, as we study more and more about trauma, the way that we process through trauma is important. So there are times and places and situations to set it up so that we can process that trauma. Um, However, there are healthy ways of journaling and of narrative experiences, um, after the fact, that can help the client get a better understanding of what happened to them, um, and also how they are interpreting what happened to them and how that's impacting their current situation. So, not a good modality again for crisis work. So, right after that immediate trauma, not a good idea. And that's what I've read consistent, with trauma work in general, is like, you don't necessarily want to journal right after a traumatic event because that can solidify a lot of the really traumatic things. Um, However, sometime down the road, when the person feels they're in a safe place to begin to process that trauma and process that event, that's where this can actually be a really powerful modality. There has been, I'm looking to my side here because I have the nifty textbook, Dr. Harris, because now I can't remember the name of the approach. Yes. Um, They've been adapting narrative therapy recently for a couple of different, um, techniques to use with trauma. Um, so the first one, is what they're calling narrative exposure therapy, and this is where, um, again, after somebody has, gone through a traumatic event, um, they're having the person kind of write through the event and pick out those details that they can reauthor so that they feel less guilt and shame around the event. Um, this one was actually, um, kind of a cool one to read about because they were using it a lot in refugee camps and they were trying to find ways to use narrative therapy but not have it be word or language based because, um, there's language barriers and people are at different levels of schooling depending on the, um, war refugee situation that they're in. So they're adapting it to trauma, but then they're also trying to adapt the modality in a way that's not so word focused. Um, so yeah, it's getting used in trauma work, but the way that you use it, you don't want to do it right after that event, but definitely down the road, it can actually be a really powerful um, modality to use for trauma.
So I love this idea of particularly using narrative and other forms, particularly as you give people the power to tell the stories the way they want to.
Mhm.
And particularly coming from a Western Eurocentric perspective that it all has to be written.
Yep.
And even in some ways that when we attempted to design some of the courses in our program, one of the ways that I kind of explored those and talked with some of the staff was everything doesn't have to be written. This very Eurocentric and Westernized. Let's look for other ways that people particularly can speak and talk, and particularly when working with kids. And I know using some of that narrative therapy that, I have this microphone here, and often as I'm working with kids, often is we're using the narrative versions of that, and that they can play newscaster, news reporter, and that they can report that story and tell that story in their own way, and that you can make it non-threatening and even, funny, the use of humor in their stories, and make it, so it seems less threatening and relaxed. And as you pay attention to pacing and even sometimes using music as a background. I know for me that music is very important to me and my people, and music relaxes, and that typically using music and songs as a way to help them tell their stories in ways that are very relaxing to them. And that I encourage that, and I don't discourage that. And I don't say, oh, you can't play this, or, this is not important. Because if that's what helps to tell their story, because it ain't my story, and part of the narrative is my releasing that piece of wanting to be in control of the narrative. And that's a lot for us. That's a reshaping and a rebranding and a reframing, because we want to be in control of what they say. And oftentimes, there's a part of the Westernized part of what we do is we go this way, go down. We want you to go this way, go to the left, go to the left. And when they're telling the story, we can't necessarily direct which path or road they go down.
So it's like Dr. Harris may have seen my slides at a time, because that was the next point I was going to get to. So skipping ahead a little bit, I have no way to grade you whether or not you do the homework. So we're going on good faith efforts here. But as you're adding a little homework to give you a chance to practice some narrative techniques on your own time, and practice in ways that aren't just writing. So just like Dr. Hare said, a big critique in the beginning of narrative therapy is that there was a lot of focus on writing and words, and that's not always the way that clients think. That's not always the way that they process. And so there has been this big move to incorporate different mediums and different ways for clients to share their stories. And if we're really trying to have this focus on client power and the subjective reality of the client, we can't be forcing our way of doing things onto them. So there are a couple of different ways that you can try using narrative techniques that are not just writing. So in the potential homework that you could do that I will never be able to check, you could journal about a problem that you're having, and you just really spill out as many details and reactions you can think of. And then as you go through that journaling process, start to pick out, like, is there a storyline? Were there trends that you noticed? Who are the main characters? Things like that. Um, and once you have that kind of spilled out onto the page, are there ways that that narrative could be changed? What happens if one detail or one event was different? Have you had another scenario that you've maybe journaled about before that had a different outcome? but you can also create art. So one technique that I read about that I thought was actually really cool is you start by drawing or painting or making a collage of whatever is that kind of problem that you're focusing on. And then you paint and draw and collage over it in a way that changes it. I also like this idea of using like blobs of color to represent emotion. So maybe you start off with a canvas that's a lot of reds and oranges for anger or something like that, and then start adding more blues, adding more greens, adding more color to it, to sort of change it and shape how it is. I also read a really cool article about somebody using scrapbooking with kids, in them being able to create a scrapbook with pictures of people and events that were important to them, but then also adding art to it to kind of explain why they chose those pictures and why those were important for them to remember. And then there's visualization exercises. So kind of pretending like your narrative was a movie and playing it through your head. Like who would be the main actor or actress? Who would play you in your narrative? And then, kind of running through the events as they happened, but then maybe going back and running through them in a different way, or trying to imagine a sequel, what would happen during that sequel. I like what Dr. Hare said about making it like a radio DJ. So that could be another auditory way of doing it, is have kids pretending that they're being a DJ or a news anchor or whoever, and using that to work through the story that they want to tell. So while it started very much word-based, I think what's really kind of cool about this approach is that now there's a lot of growth and creativity that's being brought into it. And so it's becoming more and more versatile for more and more clients, which is the whole point. It's supposed to be in an empowering modality. So, all right. Any other questions before I dive into the meat and potato NCE questions? Okay. Well, one of the things that we were supposed to promise you all was a chance to practice some questions to get ready for the NCE, whether or not you've taken it before or are going to be taking it. So I am going to post in the chat box a link for you to go to where you can enter some answers. There will be 2 questions for this one. So our first question, when you get to it, is a little bit of a scenario question. So we have a man who thinks that something is wrong with him because he's more interested in spending time with his family than excelling in his career. He says that he's embarrassed about his lack of ambition because men are supposed to be the breadwinner. A narrative therapist may say that this man's narrative is, and your choices are multi-layered, thin, superficial, or thick. So go ahead and throw in what you think that might be. We got a lot of different ideas across the board. All right, who's going to be our tiebreaker? All right. So for a narrative therapist, this particular narrative is what they would be considered thin. And that's because it is just a very baseline narrative of, you know, I think something's wrong with me because I'm supposed to be super career driven as a man, but I just want to spend time with my family. Where we could potentially thicken that plot is figuring out, like, okay, well, where do you get those ideas that as a guy you have to be the breadwinner, or that you can't be interested in spending time with your family, that you have to be focused on your career? We may ask questions like, has there been times where you've felt more motivated to advance your career because you want to do things for your family? Maybe you want to provide for them more, or you want to get to a point in your career where you get to set your own schedule so you can spend time with your kids. So there's a lot that we can do with that little blurb with the client to thicken it a little bit. So then the next question. So the next question on there, and did it switch for you guys? Do you get a new question on your page? Perfect. So this will give you a chance to type in any narrative therapy technique that you heard me talk about in this last hour and a half. Did a whole lot of talking. So somebody popped up deconstruction. That's a big one. So that's where you are asking those kind of clarifying questions to get more details from the client. Thickening the plot, thick, thin. Yeah. Telling your story. The whole point of narrative therapy is just letting the client talk and get out what they want to say. Externalization, so that moving the problem outside of the client, externalizing it. And then, yep, the sub-narrative, the subordinate narrative. What is that different story that maybe we could explore a little bit more and see if there's something else there? And the outside witnessing. So are there other people that we can bring in to kind of hear and process this narrative with us? Art and nonverbal narratives. Perfect. So not just sticking to one way of doing things, adapting it to the clients that we're working with. So that's where it's important. So good job. Definitely ready for that NCE question. So let's see. I'm going to. You guys look really good. And that's what I got from you. I hope that this was at least somewhat helpful for you today to get an understanding of this kind of new but really exciting modality. I wish this was something I could use a little bit more in the work that I do, but I will be posting in the chat the link for that exit survey to get some feedback about tonight. I can apologize for all the technical issues. My age is showing. And so I'll definitely be sticking around if you guys have any questions, but thanks for sticking with me tonight. I appreciate it.
Two or three comments I want to make. Okay,
Yes.
the same survey that Aiden has. So the people from Monday and Tuesday, the same survey that she's about to give out, you're going to need to get that survey and get the people that attended your workshop and get that to them. I know Michael has a list of folks that were there last night, and somebody else has the names of the folks that were there the night before. But that's the exact, this survey is a survey that you guys are going to need. This helps us to get outcomes. That's mainly what, outcomes for Aiden, but also for the university. And when we look at how we determine how our programs are doing. And what do you guys think about this? Because this is like innovative teaching that we're doing, experimenting to, across programs. You won't find this in a lot of programs. So, mixing different programs and demonstrating theory and this mix of NCE questions. So this is some experimentation Dr. Harris is doing just to kind of get you guys to see some of that and for you guys to give us some feedback around that. So that's what a lot of this is about. Aiden, I wanted to say exceptional job. Wanted to make a particular note of the captions at the bottom of the screen, particularly being sensitive to that for people that, hard of hearing or being able to read that. When we look at different ways, there go the cats. When we look at different ways that we can attune to listeners, learners, and tap into learning styles and how they learn, and that we are going to have different types of learners. So that's really an important consideration, and I wanted to applaud you on that and that consideration.
Well, and thank you for that. It is purely selfish. So a bit of self-disclosure. I have what's called an auditory processing disorder. I can hear perfectly fine, but my brain struggles to interpret when there's a lot of stimuli or noises around. So that's why I wear headphones a lot, even when I'm the only one here. But if you can include captions on any presentation that you do, even if it's like this, where it's not perfect and it says weird things, it is so helpful for folks like me because I am constantly reading things. So yeah, totally selfish, but
yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Harris.
yeah. Appreciate that. Anybody else have any other questions, anything? I thank you guys for your we're working with therapists because I'm gonna tell you, anybody else would have got frustrated, would have been upset, but these sensitive nature, future therapists and clinicians that you're able to, like Aiden said, to hang in there, to exercise a degree of patience. Anybody else would have caught an attitude, sent me an ugly note that I would have ignored. But I appreciate that you guys were there and that you guys hung in there, and it really just really shows me just how invaluable and this sensitivity, and it really just makes me feel good about the profession, and I appreciate it. You guys got 6 minutes, and before you get kicked out of Aiden's bootleg, we're gonna get her hooked up. Michael's gonna get her hooked up to the real Zoom for $19.95 or whatever. I don't know what kind of deals work out. We won't get her hooked up to the real Zoom, so she'll have to use the bootleg Zoom that she's been using, that she's paying for anyway through the university.
Dr. Harris, will we are we able to copy this off of Aiden's chat, or will it be sent to us in an email for us to send out to everybody?
Aiden's going to send it to you through the email.
Okay.
Yeah, our department chairperson had to there was some kinks in it early in the week, and we were trying to get it squared away, and the link wouldn't go.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm just making sure actually right now that I have everybody's names down. Again, I want you to get credit for being here and having to listen to me and deal with be very patient. Again, Dr. Harris is 100% right. Thank you for being patient. Everything I practiced went out the window.
I have everyone's name.
Oh, do you? Thank you, Michael.
$9.99, that's all.
Okay, I'll send it your way.
I swear I'm calling your probation officer. That's it.
Going down.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
There's always that one
good
person.
Too. Be good. I'm trying to be good.
This is you trying. I don't want to know what you actually do when you try.
Right? Right? Say it again, Daenerys.
It's not exactly legal, but I am trying.
Oh, we don't want to hear about all that.
Room
Great
full of
job,
therapists, they can keep a secret.
Yeah, you've been good tonight.
I'm trying to rein it in.
Great job, Aiden. Really, really great job.
Yeah.
It was
Thank
amazing.
you.
Seriously,
Yeah,
that was
thank you.
amazing.
Great job, Aiden.
Thanks,
Yeah.
guys. I really appreciate it.
And the way
So-
you put like the skills under the video, man, that was awesome. Like how you did the
Mm-hmm.
skill and then put the,
Yeah.
tagged it like that. That was super helpful.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And did you get my direct message?
I did, and then it disappeared when the Zoom logged out, but about that video, yeah. And I'm happy to show folks how to do that if they are going to end up doing their own. It's I ended up using this program online to put the whole video together. It's free to play around with. I paid like $6 a month to get full access to it. So if you end up making videos for work or training or whatever, which I do a lot of training at work, so it works for me. But you can put like all kinds of subtitles and notes and graphics and
nice.
things like that in there.
I was getting ready to say, I appreciated the subtitles.
Yeah. Put it in our I'm gonna ask that you put it in our course room. Put us the name up because I'd really be interested
Mm-hmm.
in that.
I definitely can do that.
Okay.
And yeah, they've got all kinds of like little music. That's where the guitar thing came from.
Oh, nice.
So, perfect.
Hey, Dr. Harris, or anybody, did anybody figure out like where are we submitting the presentation?
He said for us to put it in our discussion thread. So we put it in the discussion thread. I think we can put it in the one that we have for this week. We
Okay.
can put it at the bottom.